In 668 CE, Byzantine engineers unveiled a weapon that did something fire cannot do. It burned on water. Not despite the water, because of it. Enemy fleets watched it crawl across the surface toward them, wrapping around hulls, climbing rigging, consuming sails, following the sailors overboard as they jumped. The Arab fleet, the most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean, came to Constantinople twice. They left both times with their fleets destroyed. The weapon was called Greek fire, a pressurized liquid projected from bronze siphons mounted on the prows of Byzantine warships, invented by a single man, a Greek refugee from Syria named Callinicos, who arrived carrying a secret nobody else in the world possessed. The emperor recognized immediately what he had, and immediately classified it. The formula was declared a state secret, known only to the Callinicos family and the Byzantine emperors, passed from father to son with no written record, no backup, no second family. One chain of human memory between the most powerful weapon in the medieval world and oblivion. Emperor Romanos, too, declared 3 things must never reach foreign hands: imperial regalia, royal princesses, Greek fire. The first 2 were occasionally given as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers. The third never, not once, in 4 centuries. It worked. Enemies captured Greek fire in battle, seized the siphon systems, held the liquid in their hands, and could not recreate it. Not the Arabs, not the Crusaders, not the Venetians. Nobody who captured it ever produced a working equivalent. The formula was safe, untouchable, perfectly preserved inside one family across 4 centuries of war. Then Constantinople fell in 1453, the Callinicos family line broke, and Greek fire didn't get stolen, didn't get destroyed, didn't fall into enemy hands. It simply stopped existing. Historians have explanations for what it might have been: naphtha and quicklime, petroleum derivatives with pine resin and sulfur, a pressurized compound similar to early napalm, chemistry that is plausible, ingredients that are available. Modern researchers have produced liquids that burn on water and cling to surfaces. None of them work. The problem isn't the formula. Medieval sources describe Greek fire behaving in ways that suggest the delivery system was as critical as the substance itself. The pressurization, the temperature at projection, the specific bronze alloy of the siphons, the interaction between the liquid and the mechanism that propelled it. Callinicos didn't invent a chemical compound. He invented a system, one refined across generations by people who had used it, adjusted it, felt it behave differently under different sea conditions, and that kind of knowledge doesn't live in a formula. It lives in hands, in instinct built across decades of practice. When the Byzantines lost the people, they lost everything the formula alone could never have told them. Every emperor for 4 centuries chose to keep it that way, with no written record, no external archive, no second family trained as backup, no safeguard against the death of the people who carried it. They could have expanded the knowledge. They chose not to. An empire decided that the risk of the formula surviving its own civilization, falling into other hands, being turned against Christendom by whoever came next, was worse than the certainty of losing it entirely. They chose extinction over proliferation. And when Constantinople fell, they got exactly what they chose. We have every account of what Greek fire did: the Arab admirals watching their fleets burn, the chronicles of crusaders who encountered it, the Byzantine military manuals describing its deployment. We have everything except the one thing that matters. The last person who knew died in a city that no longer exists. We can describe it perfectly. We cannot make a single drop of it. You live in a world that was once protected by a weapon nobody outside one family was ever allowed to understand. The people who made that choice are gone. The weapon is gone, and we will never know if they were right. Number 9. In 2015, scientists at the University of Nottingham made a recipe from a 9th century Anglo-Saxon medical text and tested it against MRSA, the bacteria that modern medicine cannot kill. It worked. Not partially, not marginally. It killed 90% of MRSA bacteria in laboratory conditions. A recipe written 100 years ago outperformed antibiotics that have failed millions of patients. The text was called Bald's Leech Book, a medical compendium assembled in Anglo-Saxon England around 900 CE. The recipe was for an eye infection. The ingredients: garlic, onion or leek, wine, and ox bile, mixed and left in a brass vessel for 9 nights before use. Nothing about it sounds like medicine. Everything about it works like medicine. MRSA kills tens of thousands of people every year. Antibiotic resistance is one of the defining medical crises of the 21st century. a problem that the greatest pharmaceutical research infrastructure in human history has struggled to solve for decades. A working treatment existed in a manuscript for 100 years, but that is not what makes this disturbing. The combination works because of synergy. None of the individual ingredients produces the antimicrobial effect alone, only together. The garlic and onion provide allicin compounds. The wine provides alcohol and acids. The bile salts break down bacterial membranes. The brass vessel contributes copper ions. The 9-day maturation allows the compounds to react in ways that individual ingredients cannot. The medieval healers who developed this recipe had no knowledge of bacterial cell walls or copper ions or synergistic chemistry. They had observation, they had practice accumulated across generations. They had the empirical knowledge that this specific combination, prepared in this specific way, worked on infected eyes. And then, when scientific medicine arrived and declared that anything written before the germ theory of disease was superstition, that knowledge was dismissed. Systematically, deliberately, in the name of progress. We did not lose this recipe, we erased it. Bald's Leech Book contains hundreds of recipes for conditions ranging from headaches to wounds to skin infections. The eye salve is the only one that has been systematically tested against modern drug-resistant pathogens. Hundreds of others remain untested, sitting in a manuscript that was classified as historical folklore rather than practical medicine, on the assumption that medieval healers could not have known anything useful about conditions that modern science has failed to solve. That assumption has never been tested. One recipe was examined by accident because a historian noticed it looked sophisticated and asked a microbiologist to look at it. If that conversation had not happened, the recipe would still be classified as folklore while MRSA continued to kill. And here is what that means. The Nottingham team published their findings. The medical community acknowledged the result, and then almost nothing changed. The research sits in journals. Bald's Leech Book remains primarily a subject of historical scholarship rather than systematic pharmacological investigation. The other hundreds of recipes remain untested. The assumption that medieval medicine has nothing to offer modern crisis has not been fundamentally revised. We found one cure by accident and decided that was enough. How many people have died from antibiotic-resistant infections while working treatments sat in manuscripts that nobody was allowed to take seriously? We will never have a precise answer, because we made the decision to stop asking that question more than a century ago, and we have not fully reversed it yet. Number 8. In 1620, a Dutch inventor demonstrated a working submarine on the River Thames. It carried 16 people. It stayed submerged for hours. It traveled from Westminster to Greenwich underwater, and it did something that should not have been possible for another 150 years. The submarine generated its own breathable air, not through snorkel tubes, through a chemical process that produced oxygen from canisters stashed on board. Oxygen would not be officially discovered until 1774. Drebbel was recycling it in 1620. The inventor was Cornelius Drebbel, a Dutch polymath working under the patronage of King James I of England. The submarine was built of greased leather stretched over a wooden frame, propelled by oars through waterproofed leather seals, with pigskin bladders under the rowers' seats that filled with water to dive and emptied to surface. Drebbel built 3 of them, each larger than the last. The third carried 16 men. All 3 worked. Witnesses described them traveling beneath the Thames for hours without surfacing, emerging undamaged, their crews alive and breathing. The English Royal Navy watched these demonstrations. They saw a vessel that could travel underwater invisibly, approach any fleet undetected, and remain submerged long enough to be tactically useful. The technology that would define naval warfare in the 20th century, that would nearly starve Britain into submission during 2 world wars, that would reshape the geopolitical balance of the entire 20th century, was floating on the Thames in 1620. The Navy declined to pursue it. Drebbel spent the rest of his career trying to interest them and failing. He died in 1633, largely poor, running an alehouse near the river on which he had made history. The oxygen recycling method, which he never published, died with him. No record survives of how he did it. Historians have proposed that Drebbel heated potassium nitrate in a sealed vessel aboard the submarine, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. The chemistry works. The materials were available in 1620. The theory is plausible and consistent with Drebbel's known expertise in chemical reactions. There is no proof. No formula, no description from Drebbel himself of the process that kept 16 men breathing underwater for hours. In 22, the BBC rebuilt a scaled replica of Drebbel's submarine for a documentary. The construction worked. The vessel submerged and traveled as described in historical accounts. But the oxygen recycling, the thing that made extended submersion possible, could not be replicated because nobody knows how Drebbel did it. The production team used modern oxygen tanks. The most important part of the invention does not exist in any surviving document. Submarine warfare changed the course of both world wars. The U-boat campaign in the Atlantic came within weeks of forcing Britain to negotiate. Submarines reshaped naval strategy, forced the development of sonar and depth charges in convoy systems, altered the outcome of battles across the Pacific and Atlantic, and contributed to the death of hundreds of thousands of sailors and the survival or defeat of entire nations. Every ship sunk, every convoy protected or destroyed, every strategic calculation made in the shadow of the submarine threat traces back to a technology that existed and was ignored on the River Thames in 1620. Because the man who invented it died running a pub, because nobody asked him to write it down, because the Navy that watched his demonstration decided they had more important things to do. Drebbel has a crater on the moon. He is mentioned in history books as a curiosity, the builder of the first navigable submarine. The oxygen recycling method that should have made him one of the most consequential inventors in the history of warfare exists as a sentence in a footnote. We will never know what he knew. The future, where submarine technology began in 1620 and had 300 years of development before the world wars arrived, was demonstrated on the Thames and then forgotten. And the people who forgot it had no idea what they were discarding. Number 7. In 26, researchers at the University of Dresden dissolved a medieval sword in hydrochloric acid and found something inside it that should not have existed for another 400 years. Carbon nanotubes. One of the strongest materials known to modern science, not discovered until the late 20th century, not understood or producible until the 21st. Growing inside the crystalline structure of a blade forged by a medieval blacksmith who had no concept of what a carbon nanotube was and no language to describe what he was making. The blade was Damascus steel, produced from woots, a specific high-carbon crucible steel made from ore deposits in India and Sri Lanka, traded to workshops across the medieval Middle East, forged by craftsmen whose methods were passed from master to apprentice across generations spanning nearly 1,000 years. The blades were legendary, simultaneously harder than any competing steel and more flexible, capable of holding a razor edge for years without brittleness, bearing flowing wave patterns across their surface that no other metal in the world could replicate. Crusaders who encountered Damascus blades described watching European swords shatter against them. Medieval Western smiths spent decades trying to recreate the steel and failed, their hotter forges unknowingly destroying the carbon structures that gave the material its properties. The knowledge of how to make Damascus steel was lost by 1750. Not gradually, not through a long decline, but within a few generations once the specific Indian ore deposits, with their unique trace impurities of vanadium and tungsten that made woots possible, were depleted. The raw material that made the knowledge possible disappeared, and without it the knowledge had nothing to work with and nowhere to go. The depletion was not accidental. English colonial powers controlling India in the 18th century redirected iron ore resources according to their own economic priorities, without understanding or caring that they were eliminating the material basis for a metallurgical tradition 1,000 years in the making. Modern metallurgists can produce steels with similar strength. Pattern-welded blades can approximate the surface appearance. Folded steel can look like Damascus to the untrained eye. None of it is Damascus steel. The internal microstructure, the carbon nanotubes, the cementite nanowires, the specific crystalline architecture that gave the blades their impossible combination of properties, has never been fully replicated. We can describe it in precise scientific language that the medieval craftsmen who produced it would not have understood. We cannot make it. The blacksmiths of Damascus were not scientists. They had no knowledge of nanotechnology, no understanding of carbon crystalline structures, no concept of the mechanisms that made their blades superior to everything else in the world. What they had was craft knowledge accumulated across 1,000 years of practice, temperature judged by the color of heated metal, timing felt in the behavior of the material under the hammer, quality assessed by touch and sound, and the behavior of finished blades under stress. The science that now explains why their technique worked didn't exist when they were doing it. It exists now, 300 years after the technique was lost, too late to save it, and not yet sufficient to recreate it. There are approximately 60 authenticated Damascus steel blades in museum collections worldwide. Each one contains structures that materials scientists cannot reproduce. Each one is a piece of a technology that the medieval world stumbled into through accumulated craft knowledge, and the modern world has been chasing through scientific analysis for 300 years without reaching. We know what is inside them. We do not know how it got there. The men who knew were making blades in a language of touch and instinct that left no written record, and when the ore ran out, the language died with it. Number 6. On the 25th of October 1415, at Agincourt, approximately 6 English soldiers, most of them archers, defeated a French army estimated at between 12 and 36 men. The weapon that did it was a stick, a specific stick cut from a specific tree in a specific way that is still not fully understood. The English longbow could drive an arrow through plate armor at 200 meters. A trained archer could fire 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute and sustain that rate for hours. No army in medieval Europe could field a weapon with equivalent range, rate of fire, and penetrating power simultaneously. It won Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415. It defined English military dominance for 150 years across the most consequential period of medieval European warfare. And the complete knowledge of how to build one died within 2 generations of becoming obsolete. The bow required Welsh or English yew, specifically cut to include both heartwood and sapwood in precise proportion. The heartwood on the belly resisting compression as the bow was drawn. The sapwood on the back resisting tension as it was released, the combination producing a natural composite that neither wood type could achieve alone. The stave had to be seasoned for a minimum of 2 years, sometimes 4, and had to be cut from the specific portion of the tree where the 2 wood types met at exactly the ratio the bow required. The taper and geometry of the finished bow distributed stress across the entire limb in ways that prevented catastrophic failure under the enormous draw weights involved, sometimes exceeding 185 pounds, enough to make the bow essentially unusable by anyone who had not trained with one since childhood. None of these specifications were ever written down. All of it was transmitted through apprenticeship, from master to buyer to apprentice, in the language of touch and judgment that craft knowledge uses when it has never needed to become text. Arrows recovered from the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship that sank in 1545 with its crew and equipment preserved in the mud of the Solent, show construction techniques that modern bowyers and historians have argued about for decades without consensus. A ship that went down nearly 500 years ago preserved objects whose making is not fully understood today. The longbow became obsolete when gunpowder weapons reached a performance level that made massed archery uncompetitive on the battlefield. The transition happened within a few decades. Within 2 generations, the craft was abandoned, not suppressed, not deliberately erased, simply allowed to die because the economic and military incentives that had sustained it were gone. The masters aged. Their apprentices found other work. The specific knowledge of how to read a yew-stave, how to judge the proportion of the 2 wood types, how to assess the quality of seasoned material. This knowledge was never written down while there was still anyone alive who possessed it, because it had never needed to be written. It had always been taught by showing, not by telling. When the showing stopped, the knowledge stopped with it. Modern bowyers have reconstructed much of the method through experimentation and the study of surviving bows. Some have produced weapons with impressive performance characteristics, but the heaviest medieval war bows, those with draw weights above 150 pounds, remain contested. Nobody alive can definitively demonstrate how an archer used such a bow for hours in sustained combat without destroying their own musculoskeletal system. The skeletal remains of medieval archers show the answer: spinal deformities, asymmetric arm bone development, overdevelopment of the left arm that made the skeletons immediately identifiable even centuries after death. The bow shaped the body of the person who used it, beginning in childhood across a lifetime of training that cannot be compressed into adulthood. The weapon and the body were developed together. You cannot fully recreate one without the other, and you cannot recreate the body without beginning before the child turns 10. The archers who won Agincourt were not remarkable because they could use a longbow. They were remarkable because their bodies had been built by the longbow from childhood. The weapon that changed English history was not just a piece of wood. It was a decades-long transformation of the human form that ended when the military need ended and has not been replicated since. The skeletons in Portsmouth tell us what those men were. We do not know how to make another one. We stopped trying within living memory of Agincourt. And when we stopped, the knowledge of how to try went with the last person who had done it. Number 5. In the summer of 1620, King James I of England walked into Westminster Hall and began shivering. It was the middle of an English summer. Outside, London was warm. Inside, the temperature had dropped so far that the king and his courtiers were visibly cold. Cornelius Drebbel had done something to the air in that building that should not have been possible for another 282 years. The same Dutch inventor who was simultaneously building working submarines on the Thames had artificially cooled a large stone building without electricity, without refrigerant, without any technology that the history of science attributes to anyone before Willis Carrier in 1902. Contemporary accounts confirm the event. Robert Boyle mentioned it. Other witnesses recorded it. The king shivered. Nobody recorded how. Drebbel was a court inventor, employed to astonish monarchs, and he was extraordinarily good at it. In the years he spent in the service of the English crown, he demonstrated a perpetual motion clock that required no winding, a compound microscope that opened a previously invisible world, a thermostat that maintained constant temperatures in furnaces, 3 working submarines, and a process for setting scarlet dye in fabric that enabled the mass production of red cloth and transformed the European textile industry. He worked in an era before the boundaries of physics and chemistry had been drawn, when the distinction between magic and mechanism was not yet fully established, and he moved freely across problems that later centuries would assign to separate disciplines. He did not explain himself. He demonstrated. He showed what he could do and trusted that the demonstration was enough. It was not enough. The cooling of Westminster Hall was witnessed, noted, and forgotten. Historians have proposed that Drebbel dissolved saltpeter in water, exploiting an endothermic reaction that absorbs heat from the surrounding environment as the compound dissolves, a process that requires no equipment beyond containers and materials that were cheaply available in 1620. The chemistry is sound. The materials were present. The theory is consistent with Drebbel's known expertise in chemical reactions involving saltpeter, which he also used in his submarine oxygen generation system. There is no proof, no description in Drebbel's own hand, no formula, no record of the specific method beyond the fact that he used it and it worked, and a king shivered in summer and walked away impressed and moved on to the next spectacle. Drebbel's career is a catalogue of futures that arrived too early. The thermostat he invented was applied to chicken egg incubators, so modest an application that nobody recognized it as the foundation of all modern feedback control systems. The microscope he built opened a world that would become modern medicine, but not until Antony van Leeuwenhoek refined the design 40 years later and received the credit. The submarine he demonstrated was seen and forgotten by the Navy that would spend 300 years without one. Every invention Drebbel produced was a future that someone else eventually reached, decades or centuries later, and named as their own discovery, unaware that the destination had already been visited. Willis Carrier's air conditioning patent in 1902 changed the world. It made tropical cities habitable. It enabled modern architecture by removing the constraint that buildings had to be designed around natural ventilation. It transformed food storage and preservation. It allowed the populations of previously uninhabitable regions, the American South, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, to grow into modern industrial economies. Every aspect of its subsequent development was shaped by the assumption that the problem had first been solved in 1902. 282 years of alternative development, of refinement and adaptation and engineering evolution that might have proceeded from Drebbel's starting point did not happen, because a king shivered for an afternoon, said he was impressed, and walked outside into the summer heat, and nobody asked the man who had chilled the air to explain himself before he died. Drebbel died in 1633. He left almost nothing in writing, a few letters, a brief philosophical treatise, some observations on chemical reactions. He was not a documenter, he was a demonstrator. He knew what he could do and he showed it, and he trusted that showing was sufficient. He was wrong. The future where climate control began in 1620 and had nearly 3 centuries of development before the industrial age arrived was demonstrated once in Westminster Hall and then forgotten. Not burned, not suppressed, forgotten, which is its own kind of erasure. Number 4. In 1234, Korean craftsmen of the Goryeo dynasty printed a book using metal movable type. Johannes Gutenberg would not print his Bible for another 221 years. The oldest surviving book produced with metal movable type is the Jikji, printed in Korea in 1377, 78 years before Gutenberg's press began operating. By the time the Gutenberg Bible appeared in 1455, Korea had developed at least 6 distinct fonts of metal type and had been printing with them for more than 2 centuries. The French scholar Henri-Jean Martin, examining Korean metal type against Gutenberg's, described them as extremely similar, not as a primitive ancestor or a crude precursor. Extremely similar. The technology that ignited the Renaissance, enabled the Reformation, drove the scientific revolution, and created the modern world existed in Korea 221 years before it existed in Europe, and it never crossed the ocean. The Goryeo metalworkers cast individual bronze characters that could be arranged in frames, inked, pressed to paper, and rearranged for the next page. The process was laborious for Korean script, which required thousands of distinct characters rather than the 24 letters of a European alphabet. But it worked. The books were real. The type was real. The technology was functional and sophisticated and maintained across generations of craftsmen who refined it continuously. It was not a single invention. It was a living technological tradition. The printing press is considered one of the most consequential inventions in human history. It broke the monopoly on knowledge held by institutions wealthy enough to employ scribes. It made literacy economically accessible. It allowed ideas to spread faster than any previous technology. It created the conditions for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the political revolutions of the 18th century. All of this happened in Europe in the 15th century because one man built a press in Mainz. Korea had the press in 1234. The technology never spread west. The Mongol invasions of Korea in the 13th century disrupted Goryeo civilization at exactly the period when the printing technology was being developed and consolidated. The Silk Road trade routes that connected East Asia to the Islamic world and Europe were controlled in the 13th century by the Mongol Empire, whose destruction of Baghdad in 1258 and whose wars across Central Asia produced exactly the wrong political conditions for the peaceful transmission of Korean technological knowledge to European craftsmen who might have understood its significance. The geography was wrong. The politics were catastrophic. The timing ensured that the most consequential invention of the medieval period sat in Korea for 221 years while the world it could have transformed remained unaware of its existence. If Korean movable type had reached Europe in 1250, through a single monk traveling the Silk Road, through a single trader who understood what he was carrying, through any of the many channels through which knowledge had moved between civilizations for centuries, the printing press might have arrived in Europe 200 years early, not as a speculation, as a technology that already existed, that had been refined across decades of use, that was ready to be applied to an alphabetic script the moment someone with the knowledge reached a place where the letters existed. The Renaissance might have begun in the 13th century. The Reformation might have preceded the Black Death rather than following it by a century. The scientific revolution might have been in full development before Columbus was born. The world that did not happen because a piece of technology never crossed the right ocean is not a small counterfactual. It is a different civilization. 2 additional centuries of mass literacy, 2 additional centuries of scientific publication, 2 additional centuries of ideas spreading faster than armies. Every war, every plague, every theological persecution, every famine that occurred between 1234 and 1455 occurred in a world without the printing press. It might not have occurred the same way in a world with one. The Jikji, the oldest surviving metal-type printed book, is currently held in the National Library of France in Paris. It was taken to France in the late 19th century by a French diplomat and never returned. The oldest physical artifact of the technology that Korea developed and the world ignored sits in a foreign archive, acknowledged as historically significant, treated as a museum object, and returned to nobody. The technology was erased by geography and conquest. Its evidence has been erased by custody. The erasure, in its way, continues. Number 3. In 2021, researchers at National Taiwan University analyzed wood shavings collected from inside a Stradivarius violin during routine repair. What the chemical analysis revealed about the wood should not have been there. The cellulose structure had been altered at the molecular level. The hemicellulose, the most hygroscopic fiber component in wood, had degraded by approximately 1/3, reducing the wood's tendency to absorb moisture and altering the way it vibrated. The lignin had oxidized. The mineral content included aluminum, calcium, copper, sodium, potassium, and zinc in combinations not found in naturally aged wood of any species or age. The material was not just old, It had been chemically transformed into something that does not occur in nature, by a process applied deliberately, by hands that have been dead for nearly 3 centuries, using a method that no one living knows. Antonio Stradivari was born in Cremona in 1644 and died there in 1737 at the age of 93, having made approximately 1/100 string instruments across a working career that spanned more than 6 decades. Of these, roughly 550 violins survive in playable condition. They sell at auction for millions. The Lady Blunt Stradivarius sold for $15.9 million in 2011, and they are the most studied musical instruments in history. Acoustic analysis, laser scanning, kinetic imaging, X-ray fluorescence, and now nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy have all been applied to their construction. 3 centuries of luthiers have examined them, measured them, copied their dimensions, and attempted to reproduce their sound. None have succeeded in reproducing the sound in a way that the instruments themselves cannot be distinguished from by trained experts who know what they are listening for. The chemical treatment that altered the wood was not applied for acoustics. Cremona in the 17th century had a worm infestation. Stradivari soaked his wood in a cocktail of borax, zinc, copper, alum, and lime water to protect it from insects. He was not trying to improve the sound of his instruments. He was trying to prevent them from being eaten before he could finish making them. The pest control treatment accidentally cross-linked the wood fibers at the molecular level, altering the resonance properties of the material in ways that Stradivari never intended, never fully understood, and never documented. The greatest instrument maker in history created his masterpieces partly by accident, and the accident cannot be reproduced because the exact process has been lost. The exact treatment is still not fully known. But 2021 researchers identified the minerals and the altered molecular structure. They did not recover the precise sequence of treatments, the concentrations used, the temperatures applied, or the timing of each stage. Stradivari kept no records. There were no patents in 17th century Cremona. The knowledge was proprietary, kept secret from competitors in a city where instrument making was an intensely competitive trade, and it was passed only within the workshop, through direct instruction that left no documentary trace. When Stradivari died, the last person who knew the exact process died with him. Some researchers argue that the Stradivarius mystique is partly mythology. In 1929, a blindfolded audience heard a violinist alternate between a $2 million Stradivarius and 4 modern instruments of high quality. Of 180 listeners, only 39 identified the Stradivarius as the best sounding. The difference may be real but subtle, inflated by 3 centuries of reverence into something larger than the acoustic evidence supports, but the chemical difference is not subtle. It is measurable, reproducible, and distinct from every modern instrument and from every other antique instrument not made in Cremona during the period. The wood is physically different at the molecular level from any wood produced today. Something was done to it that has not been done since. Whether or not human ears can reliably detect the acoustic result, the material itself is unique, irreproducible, and deteriorating. The Cremonese masters worked within a confluence of conditions that no longer exist and cannot be recreated. The spruce they used grew during the Little Ice Age, a period of reduced solar activity that produced denser, more uniform wood than any spruce grown today. The local pest problem that prompted the chemical treatment no longer exists. The workshop tradition that transmitted the knowledge from master to apprentice died when the tradition died. And the 550 surviving instruments, each one a fragment of the lost process, are being slowly consumed by the act of being used, played, repaired, the original material incrementally replaced and diminished. When the last Stradivarius becomes unplayable, the last physical evidence of a lost chemical process will be gone, not as a formula, as an object, and nobody alive knows how to make another one. Number 2. In 1206, an engineer working in a palace in Mesopotamia completed a book describing 50 mechanical devices. One of them was a programmable robot band, 4 mechanical musicians mounted on a boat, performing music whose rhythm and melody could be changed by repositioning pegs on a rotating drum. The drum stored instructions, the pegs encoded them, the musicians executed the program. 800 years before the first digital computer, the engineer was Ismail al-Jazari, and the book was the Kitab fi Marifat al-Hayal al-Handasiyya, the book of knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices. Al-Jazari invented the crankshaft, the device that converts rotary motion to linear motion and makes internal combustion engines possible. He invented segmental gears, which would not appear in European engineering until 1364, and would not enter general European technical vocabulary until 1501. He invented feedback control systems, mechanisms that sensed their own output and adjusted their operation to maintain stability, 2 centuries before the principle was formally described by Western science. He designed automatic doors triggered by water clocks, hand-washing devices with humanoid figures that offered soap and towels, combination locks, water-raising machines, and a castle clock of such complexity that researchers spent decades fully understanding its mechanism. He described all 50 devices in sufficient detail that they could be built from the instructions, and he illustrated them with miniature paintings that survived when text alone might not have. The principle underlying Al-Jazari's programmable drum, instructions stored in a physical medium, executed sequentially by a mechanical system, is the foundational operational principle of all computing, not a metaphor, not an analogy, the same principle. The difference between a peg drum and a modern processor is implementation scale and speed. The concept is identical. Al-Jazari was working with this concept in 1206. Alan Turing formalized it in 1936. The gap between them is 730 years. On the 13th of February 1258, Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan completed the sack of Baghdad. The city had been the intellectual center of the medieval world for 5 centuries. The House of Wisdom, the library and academy founded under the Abbasid caliphs in the 8th century, contained the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Greek world in Arabic translation, alongside 5 centuries of original Islamic scholarship in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, chemistry, and philosophy. The Mongols burned it. Contemporary accounts describe the Tigris River running black with the ink of destroyed books for days. The specific number of volumes lost is not known. Estimates are meaningless against the scale of the event. What is known is that the Islamic Golden Age, 500 years of systematic scientific advancement, the most productive period of intellectual output between classical antiquity and the European Renaissance, ended in 1 week. Historians note that Al-Jazari's book survived because copies existed outside Baghdad when the Mongols arrived. His work was not entirely destroyed. It was transmitted partially through manuscripts that reached later scholars, but the tradition that produced it was not transmitted. Al-Jazari was not a solitary genius who emerged from nothing. He was the product of 500 years of accumulated engineering knowledge, the translation movement that brought Greek mechanics and Persian water technology and Indian mathematics to Islamic scholars in the 8th and 9th centuries, the generations of engineers who refined those foundations in the courts of Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba, the institutions that trained them and funded their work and built on each other's discoveries across centuries of continuous development. All of that was burned in 1258. What survived was fragments of output. What was lost was the tradition itself, the living continuity of engineers who built on each other's work, who trained the next generation, who pushed further than any individual starting from scratch could push alone. The crankshaft appears in European engineering records in the 15th century, more than 200 years after Al-Jazari described it. The segmental gear appears in European records in 1364. Feedback control systems are formalized by James Watt in the 18th century and mathematically described in the 19th. Every major engineering principle that Al-Jazari demonstrated was rediscovered by European engineers who had no access to his work and no knowledge that the discovery had already been made. Centuries of duplicated effort. Centuries of problems solved twice, because the first solution was underwater in the Tigris. Leonardo da Vinci, whose engineering notebooks are treated as the pinnacle of Renaissance mechanical thinking, may have been working in the shadow of Al-Jazari's tradition without knowing it. The connection is indirect and historically contested, but the similarities between some of Leonardo's mechanical designs and Al-Jazari's earlier solutions have been noted by historians of technology, and the transmission path, through surviving Arabic manuscripts, through Italian contact with Islamic science, through the fragmentary inheritance of what the Mongols did not reach, is not implausible. If the connection is real, the most celebrated mechanical genius of the Renaissance was building on the ruins of a tradition that had been burned 200 years before he was born. The summit Leonardo reached may have been the starting point for where Islamic engineering was heading when Hulagu arrived. The House of Wisdom took 5 centuries to build. It took 1 week to burn. We know what was in it only from the fragments that survived and from the gaps, the engineering principles that European scholars spent centuries rediscovering, the medical knowledge that had to be rebuilt, the astronomical observations that were lost and had to be remade at enormous cost of time and effort. The Tigris ran black for days, and the futures contained in those books ran with it. Number 1. In the autumn of 1900, a sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis descended off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera and found a shipwreck. Among the bronze statues and corroded cargo he brought to the surface was a lump of bronze about the size of a thick dictionary. It sat in the National Museum of Athens for 2 years before a curator looked closely at it. When he did, he found gears inside. Not a few gears, 37 meshing bronze gears of extraordinary precision, arranged in a mechanism that could predict the positions of the sun and moon, calculate the timing of solar and lunar eclipses, track the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, and model the movements of all 5 planets known to the ancient world. The device was built around 100 BCE. The level of mechanical sophistication it represents would not appear again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism is not an isolated object. Fragments of Byzantine-era geared devices from the 5th and 6th centuries show the tradition continued. Al-Biruni described a geared astronomical calendar around 1000 CE. A 13th-century Islamic astrolabe contains clockwork of comparable complexity. The tradition that produced the Antikythera mechanism was not a single flash of genius that appeared and vanished. It was a living engineering tradition that persisted across more than 1,000 years and 3 civilizations, Greek, Byzantine, Islamic, and that produced, at its peak, a device that the modern world took 120 years to fully understand, and then it was gone. Historians note that European mechanical clockmaking emerged in the 13th and 14th centuries, and that this may represent a partial survival of the ancient tradition through Arabic intermediaries, each transmission degraded by the loss of institutional continuity that accompanied conquest and collapse. The escapement mechanism that makes mechanical clocks possible may descend through a chain of partial transmissions from Islamic clockmaking, which descended from Byzantine, which descended from Greek. The tradition may not have been entirely erased, just degraded, fragmented, rebuilt from increasingly impoverished starting points, each reconstruction beginning from a lower baseline than the one before. But look at the baseline that was lost. Medieval European clocks were genuine achievements. They told time, they rang bells, they drove astronomical displays. The Antikythera mechanism modeled the cosmos with an accuracy, its eclipse prediction cycle correct to within hours, its planetary positions matched to observable reality, that European clockmaking would not approach for 300 years after mechanical clocks were invented. Whatever was transmitted through the degraded chain of copying and partial reconstruction, it was not the full sophistication of what had existed. The gap between the Antikythera mechanism and a medieval European clock is not the gap between 2 versions of the same tradition. It is the gap between a peak and a slope. This is not a story about one lost machine. It is a story about a pattern that runs across all 10 items on this list and extends beyond them into a question that has no comfortable answer. Greek fire was built across 4 centuries and deliberately killed by the civilization that possessed it, rather than risk the knowledge surviving into the wrong hands. Damascus steel was built across 1,000 years and erased when the raw material that made it possible was consumed by colonial indifference. Al-Jazari's engineering tradition was built across 5 centuries and burned in 1 week when an army decided that the books of a conquered city had no value. Korean movable type existed 2 centuries before the world needed it, and never crossed the geography that separated it from the people who could have used it. The Stradivarius treatment was kept secret for competitive advantage and died with the men who possessed it, because secrecy, in the end, is indistinguishable from erasure. Drebbel invented the submarine, air conditioning, and the recycling of oxygen in a single lifetime and died poor because the institutions of his era were not equipped to recognize what they were watching. The pattern is not loss. Loss implies accident, something dropped and not found. The pattern is erasure, in all its forms: deliberate erasure by secrecy, erasure by conquest, erasure by indifference, erasure by the death of the people who held knowledge that was never committed to any medium that could survive them, erasure by the failure of institutions to understand what they possessed before it was too late to preserve it. 10 different mechanisms of erasure. 10 different civilizations. 10 different centuries. The same result. The question the Antikythera mechanism raises, the question that all 10 items on this list raise together, is not about the past. It is about the baseline. If the most sophisticated mechanical tradition in human history was built, degraded, partially rebuilt, degraded again, partially rebuilt again, each time from a lower starting point, how many other traditions followed the same trajectory? How many peaks exist in the archaeological and historical record that we recognize as peaks only because fragments survived? How many peaks left no fragments at all? How many versions of the future were built and erased before we arrived at this one? We do not live in the most advanced version of human civilization that could have existed by this point in time. We live in the version that survived. Survival and advancement are not the same thing. The Antikythera mechanism is in a glass case in Athens, understood now as well as it has been understood in 2 years. A monument to a tradition of thinking about the cosmos and building machines to model it that took more than a millennium to reach its peak and less than a century to be reduced to fragments. The gears are still there, still turning, in the sense that we are still studying them, still telling us something about what was possible once and is not possible now. Whether we are ready to hear what they are saying is another question. We have the machine, we lost the civilization that made it, and we have been trying to understand what we lost ever since we found it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.